Silence is a lie told by the void. We believe that in the spaces between stars there is nothing, only the cold indifference of the cosmos. We were wrong. There are hungers in this universe that predate the imperium of man. There is the Great Devourer, the Tyranid Hive Mind, a biological inevitability that consumes all biomass, leaving dead worlds in its wake. It is the shadow in the warp. But there is another shadow, a cold, psionic malignancy from a dimension adjacent to our own, a realm of ash, decay, and rot. It does not wish to eat our flesh, it wishes to wear it. It seeks to drown the galaxy in a cold, gray, psychic ocean. Tonight, the irresistible force of biological perfection meets the immovable object of psychic corruption. Tonight, the hive mind looks into the abyss, and the abyss looks back with 1,000,000,000,000 eyes. What happens when the biomass that connects all Tyranids becomes the very conduit for their enslavement? Welcome to the Crossverse. Magos Biologicus Kalin of the Adeptus Mechanicus did not trust his ocular implants. He stood upon the rusted gantry of Outpost Delta 9, the wind whipping his crimson robes around his mechadendrites, staring up at a sky that had betrayed the imperial truth. The atmosphere of Vidia 4, once a predictable slate gray of industrial smog, had bruised into a sickening necrotic violet. It was not the kaleidoscopic madness of the warp, nor the spore-choked yellow of a Tyranid invasion. It was the color of a dead limb deprived of blood. Snow fell, or so it seemed, but when Kalin extended a copper-plated skeletal hand to catch a flake, it did not melt. It crumbled into gray, desiccated ash. His internal cogitators screamed with binary dissent, struggling to process atmospheric readings that made no logical sense. The temperature had plummeted 20 degrees in a single standard hour, yet there was no wind chill, only a pervasive, stagnant cold that seemed to bypass the flesh and gnaw directly at the bone. The machine spirit of his Auspex scanner whimpered, a low static whine in his auditory receptors, as it failed to identify the source of the particulate matter. It was not combustion ash, it was decayed biological matter, flakes of skin and bone raining from the stratosphere. Kalin turned his attention to the dissection table, where a local Grox beast lay restrained. The creature was technically alive, its heart beating a sluggish rhythm on the biomonitors, yet it was rotting before his very eyes. This was not the joyous, bloating fecundity of Grandfather Nurgle. There was no pus, no swelling, no life in this death. It was a dry, hollow necrosis. The beast's flesh turned gray and flaked away like wet paper, revealing blackening bones beneath. Kalin engaged his surgical mechadendrite, the monomolecular laser scalpel humming as he made an incision. There was no blood flow. Instead, a thick black sludge oozed from the wound, smelling of ozone and old graves. He zoomed his optical lens to the microscopic level, projecting the image onto his retina. The cells were not fighting an infection, they were being rewritten. The mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, were being replaced by a dark crystalline structure that absorbed light. The fauna of Vidia 4 was not dying, it was being terraformed into something that could exist only in a dimension of shadows. The flesh is weak, Kalin intoned, the binary cant slipping from his vocalizer. But this makes the flesh obsolete. The silence was the worst part. Kalin abandoned the dissection and moved deeper into the facility, his Skitarii Rangers falling into step behind him, their galvanic rifles scanning the flickering corridors. Usually, the noosphere, the wireless digital web connecting all Mechanicus technology, hummed with the chatter of data servitors and the prayers of the faithful. Now it was filled with a headache-inducing static, a rhythmic throbbing that felt like a migraine pushed through a voxcaster. He attempted to hail the astropathic choir in the spire, needing to send a distress code to the sector fleet. There was no response. Upon forcing the door to the astropath chamber, Kalen stopped. The 3 astropaths were suspended in their grav harnesses, floating limply. They were not dead, nor were they screaming in the agony of warp exposure. They were comatose, their eyes rolled back to show pure white, blood trickling from their noses in perfect unison. They were all seeing the same thing. The psychic presence dampening the planet was not the chaotic storm of the Empyrean. It was a singular, ordered, and hateful will, a hive mind of a different breed. The alert klaxons began to sound, not the standard Imperial alarm, but a proximity warning from the Promethium refinery in Sector 7. Kalen and his Skitarii unit boarded a macro hauler, speeding across the ash-covered wastes toward the industrial complex. As the refinery came into view, the geometry of the world seemed to warp. The massive cooling towers, usually pillars of imperial might, looked twisted, overlaid with a translucent, shimmering film of decay. The air here was thick with spores, floating distinct particles that glowed with a faint malevolent bioluminescence. The lumen strips flickering overhead buzzed with an angry intensity, popping one by one as Kalen advanced. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, detaching themselves from the objects that cast them. A Skitarii ranger near the rear of the formation suddenly halted, his radium carbine clattering to the floor. Kalen spun around. The ranger was being lifted into the air, feet kicking helplessly, suspended by nothing visible. Then the shadows on the wall coalesced, forming long spectral claws that wrapped around the soldier's throat, squeezing the metal and flesh until the neck snapped with the sound of a dry branch breaking. They reached the heart of the refinery, the central fusion chamber. Here, reality had finally capitulated. The main blast door had been torn open, not outwards, but inwards, as if suctioned by a vacuum. In the center of the room, hovering over the fusion core, was a tear in the fabric of the materium. It was a gate. Massive, fleshy tendrils, black and slimy like the intestines of a leviathan, radiated outward from the rift, anchoring it to the steel floor. The gate pulsed with a red biological light. Through the tear, Kalen could see another Vidia 4, a mirror dimension where the sky was a storm of red lightning and the air was thick with ash. Something was trying to push through. A hand, pale, elongated, and skeletal, gripped the edge of the rift. Then another. The reality of the 41st millennium groaned under the stress as the anomaly widened. Kalen raised his plasma pistol, his logic circuits calculating 0 probability of survival. "Contact," he whispered. From the gate, a psychic scream erupted, so powerful it cracked the lenses of his optical implants. The shadow had arrived. In the cold, crushing silence of the void, the Great Devourer did not sleep. It drifted, a nebulous cloud of billion-fold consciousness, vast enough to swallow stars. Hive Fleet Kronos, the specialized tendril of the Tyranid race, bred specifically to hunt the corruptions of chaos, tasted the galaxy on the etheric wind. It sought the tangled, spicy resonance of the warp to devour. But on the world of Vidia 4, it tasted something wrong. To the hive mind, a prey world usually appeared as a beacon of warmth, the vibrant heat of biological life waiting to be harvested. But Vidia 4 was dimming. It was not disappearing, it was being overlaid by a cold, suffocating gray film. The hive mind's psychic senses, usually the absolute authority in the immaterium, encountered a sensation it had rarely felt in eons of consumption: resistance. Not the frantic, fiery resistance of a dying prey animal, nor the chaotic, bubbling madness of the warp. This was a stubborn, static interference. It was a headache in the mind of a god. The shadow in the warp, the terrifying psychic null field projected by the hive fleet, reached out to smother the planet's light, expecting to snuff out all hope. Instead, it collided with a psionic wall of pure apathy. The analysis was instantaneous, processed through the synaptic relays of 1,000 Norn queens simultaneously. The data screamed of arrival. This was not a prey species defending its burrow. This was another apex predator marking its territory. The flavor of this new psychic presence was ash and rot, a mirror dimension trying to parasitize the materium. The hive mind felt a ripple of biological offense. All biomass belonged to the Tyranids. To rot was to waste. To waste was a sin against the hunger. The imperative pulsed through the fleet, overriding the standard patterns of infiltration. There would be no slow cultist subversion. There would be no waiting. The hive mind shifted its massive bioships, leviathans of chitin and flesh the size of cities, angling their proboscis launchers toward the gravity well of the doomed world. The hunger shifted from simple feeding to aggressive eradication. The rival shadow must be purged so the biomass could be reclaimed. The launch sequence was a symphony of wet, organic violence. Along the flanks of the massive hive ships, thousands of sphincters dilated, dripping with amniotic fluids. With a collective contraction that shuddered through the hive fleet's synaptic web, the mycenic spores were expelled. They were not sleek metal pods, but armored teardrops of bone and meat, shielded by heat-ablative scales. Inside each one, beasts of war slumbered in a soup of nutrients, their heartbeats synced to the rhythm of the hive mind. They fell in silence for a moment, a rain of biological artillery against the backdrop of the stars, before the gravity of Vidia 4 caught them. The hive mind focused its attention on these descending seeds, guiding their trajectory with mathematical precision. They were not aimed at random population centers. They were aimed at the cold spots, the areas where the static interference was strongest. The hive mind sought to drive a dagger into the heart of the anomaly. The atmosphere screamed as the invasion made contact. Usually, a Tyranid descent paints the sky in streaks of terrifying orange fire, a sign of the end times. But as the spores punched through the upper stratosphere of Vidia 4, they hit the Mind Flayer's storm. The clash was visible to the naked eye. The burning orange contrails of the Tyranid pods slammed into the bruised violet clouds of the Upside Down's influence. Lightning, red and malevolent, arced out from the clouds, striking the falling spores. This was not natural weather. The planet itself was rejecting the invaders. The hive mind felt the deaths of hundreds of spores instantly as the necrotic lightning boiled the fluids inside them, cooking the gaunts before they could be born. But the Tyranids had numbers that defied comprehension. For every spore that withered and turned to ash in the sky, 10 more punched through the cloud layer, trailing smoke and screaming their defiance. The sky became a war zone of colors, the biological fire of the Great Devourer warring against the cold gray gloom of the shadow monster. Impact. The ground of Vidia 4 shuddered as the first wave of tyrannocytes slammed into the crust, throwing up plumes of irradiated soil and gray snow. The fleshy sides of the pods blossomed open like grotesque flowers, spilling amniotic slime onto the frozen earth. From the birthing sacs, the swarm poured forth, termagants with their borer beetle weapons, hormagaunts with bounding talons, and the hulking silhouettes of Tyranid warriors. The synapse web snapped into place, a rigid grid of command overriding the fear of the individual beasts. Through the eyes of 1,000 warriors, the hive mind looked upon its enemy. It saw the twisted, vine-covered refinery. It saw the Demodogs prowling the shadows. It sensed the cold intelligence watching from the rift. The Tyranids hissed, their chittering cries drowning out the wind. They did not roar, they clicked and snapped, a sound like 1,000,000 dry bones breaking. The shadow in the warp pushed down, the Mind Flayer pushed back. The war for the soul of the planet had begun. Sergeant Varus of the Cadian 812th Void Hounds wiped a layer of gray rime from the magnocular lens of his las pistol. He was a man bred for war, born in the shadow of the pylons before Cadia fell, and he knew the smell of the enemy. Or at least, he thought he did. Crouched in a hastily dug trench line composed of frozen mud and promethium barrels, Varus sniffed the air. It smelled of ozone, wet dog, and the copper tang of blood, but beneath it all was the cloying sweetness of rot. "Steady," he growled over the box bead, his voice gravel against the rising panic of his squad. To his left, Trooper Carlyle was shaking, not from the biting cold that had settled over the refinery, but from the sound echoing off the canyon walls. It was a sound like 1,000,000 dry leaves skittering over concrete. The Tyranids were coming. But the shadows in the trench seemed to be moving on their own, lengthening and twisting despite the static nature of the overhead lumen strips. Varus gripped his chainsword, the motor idling with a hungry purr. "Target protocols remain," he barked. "If it has more than 2 arms, kill it. If it's dead but still walking, kill it again." The first wave hit the perimeter with the force of a tidal wave made of knives. "Contact! Front!" screamed the heavy bolter team. The darkness beyond the floodlights erupted into a sea of purple carapace and ivory bone. Hormagaunts, the foot soldiers of the Great Devourer, bounded over the ferrocrete barricades in a blur of screeching violence. "First rank, fire! Second rank, fire!" Varus's commands were automatic, drilled into his cortex. The air turned into a strobe light of red las fire. The disciplined volleys of the Cadians punched holes in the chitinous tide, exploding heads and severing limbs. Ichors sprayed the snow, hissing as it touched the frozen ground. But for every Xenos beast that fell, 3 more scrambled over its corpse, using the dead as a ramp. Varus saw Carlyle go down, a Hormagaunt's scything talon driven through his flak armor. The sergeant stepped forward, revving his chainsword to a scream, and sawed the beast in half at the waist. He kicked the twitching torso away, but as he looked up he realized the firing line was about to be overrun. They were drowning in teeth and claws. Then the ground betrayed them all. The earth beneath the charging Tyranid Swarm erupted. It wasn't an explosion of fire, but of flesh. Black, glistening vines, thick as a man's thigh, burst from the permafrost, lashing out like whips. Following the vines came the others. They looked like skinned dogs, their heads opening like flower petals lined with needle teeth, the Demodogs. They did not attack the humans. With a feral, mindless hunger, they threw themselves at the Tyranids. Varus watched in stunned silence as the battlefield descended into absolute anarchy. A Hormagaunt, mid-leap, was snatched out of the air by a black tendril and slammed into the concrete. A pack of Demodogs tore into a Tyranid warrior, their teeth finding the soft joints in its armor. The Tyranids, creatures of perfect biological unity, seemed confused. Their prey was fighting back with a savagery that matched their own. It was a clash of 2 nightmares, the insectoid perfection of the galaxy's fringe against the fleshy, cancer-like rot of the parallel dimension. The turning point, the moment the universe seemed to gag, happened 10 meters from Varus's position. A Hormagaunt, frenzied by the synapse command to feed, pinned a Demodog to the ground. With a wet crunch, the Tyranid bit deep into the Demodog's shoulder, tearing away a chunk of the gray necrotic flesh. It swallowed. Varus expected the Tyranid to move on, energized by the biomass. Instead, the creature froze. It began to shriek, not a battle cry, but a sound of mechanical distress. Its purple carapace began to turn a sickly, bruised black. Veins of dark necrosis shot through its body, visible even through the chitin. The Tyranid convulsed, vomiting up a slurry of black fluids before collapsing, its limbs twitching in a seizure. The Mind Flayer's biology was incompatible. It was not food, it was poison. The connection to the hive mind snapped in that localized area. The Tyranids around the dying beast faltered, their movements becoming sluggish and uncoordinated as the taste of the poison filtered back through the synaptic web. "Trone of Terra," Varus whispered, watching the scene unfold. The Tyranid advance had stalled. The Great Devourer had taken a bite of the apple and found it rotten. The black vines were now spreading rapidly, reacting to the presence of the Tyranids like an immune system attacking a virus. They wrapped around the legs of the Gaunts, dragging them down into the mud where the Demodogs waited. The battlefield was becoming a swamp of gray muck and alien blood. Varus realized that the Cadians were no longer combatants. They were witnesses to a war between gods. "Pull back," he roared, grabbing the Voxcaster. "All units, fall back to the secondary line. Let them eat each other." As the guardsmen scrambled backwards, firing suppression bursts into the melee, Varus took one last look. A massive Tyranid warrior was hacking at the vines with bone swords, but the rot was spreading up his arms, turning the living weapon into dust. The hive mind had found something it could not digest. Subject 9 Theta, a lictor of the Hive Fleet, did not exist. To the naked eye, it was merely a heat shimmer against the rusted bulkhead of Sector 4, a distortion of light and shadow engineered by millions of years of predatory evolution. Its chameleonic scales shifted in ripples of slate gray and rust brown, perfectly mimicking the industrial decay of the refinery. It hung inverted from a coolant pipe, its feeder tendrils quivering as they tasted the air. The hive mind flowed through it, a cold, diamond-hard directive that overrode all instinct save one: locate the node. The swarm below was dying, confused by the poisoned meat of the enemy, but the hive mind had calculated a solution. It sought the source of the control signal. It sought the Alpha. Below, amidst the wreckage of a loading dock, a lone human figure stood motionless. It was a refinery worker, clad in tattered overalls, but its posture was wrong. It stood too still. Its skin was pale and veined with black necrotic tracks. The lictor's compound eyes analyzed the target: minimal thermal output, 0 heart rate, massive psionic resonance. This was not prey. This was a puppet. The lictor moved. It was a blur of violence that defied the sluggish atmosphere of the world. It dropped from the ceiling, flesh hooks extending, aiming to decapitate the puppet and consume its brain matter to absorb its memories. In the millisecond before impact, the lictor anticipated the wet tear of flesh and the crunch of bone. It was the perfect hunter, the unseen death. But the prey did not flinch. It did not raise a hand to defend itself. Instead, the air around the human distorted. A wall of kinetic force, cold and heavy as a glacier, slammed into the lictor mid-air. The impact was silent but devastating. The lictor's chitinous carapace cracked, and it was hurled backward, smashing through a concrete pillar. The beast hit the ground, rolling to its feet instantly, hissing a challenge. The element of surprise, the lictor's greatest weapon, had been nullified. The prey knew it was there. The prey had been waiting. Through the sensory link of the lictor, the hive mind felt a sensation akin to curiosity, followed immediately by revulsion. The human figure turned slowly. Its eyes were gone, replaced by pools of shifting black smoke. It raised a hand, fingers splayed. The lictor attempted to leap, its powerful leg muscles coiling to launch it sideways, but gravity ceased to apply. The massive Tyranid bioform was lifted off the ground, suspended in a telekinetic grip that felt like invisible iron bands crushing its thorax. The lictor thrashed, its scything talons slicing through the air, but there was nothing to cut. This enemy did not fight with claws or bioacid, it fought with the fabric of reality itself. The lictor shrieked, a sound of frustration that echoed in the warp. The hive mind poured more will into the creature, trying to force it to move, to break the hold, but the psychic pressure was immense. It was like trying to swim upstream in a river of mercury. The ground beneath the suspended lictor cracked open. The black vines, now familiar to the invaders, slithered out like seeking vipers. They did not strike with the chaotic flailing seen on the front lines. Here, in the presence of the Avatar, they moved with purpose. They wrapped around the lictor's limbs, binding the scything talons, gagging the feeder tendrils, and anchoring the beast to the floor. The lictor's strength was legendary. It could tear open the hull of a tank, but for every vine it snapped, two more took its place, tightening until the bioform was spread-eagled, immobilized. The human vessel walked forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. It stopped inches from the lictor's face. The smell coming from the human was not of sweat or fear, but of old dust and cold voids. The lictor stared into the black eyes of the vessel, and for the first time, the hive mind looked directly into the face of the Mind Flayer. The vessel placed a hand on the lictor's exposed forehead, right between the sensory plates. The physical touch was irrelevant, the psychic intrusion was catastrophic. The Mind Flayer did not attempt to destroy the lictor's mind, it attempted to enter it. A psychic virus, cold and gray, surged through the lictor's synaptic connectors. It raced up the neural link, seeking the connection to the hive ship in orbit. The lictor convulsed, its chameleonic skin flashing wildly between colors, red, black, white, gray, as two godlike wills battled for control of its flesh. The hive mind, realizing the danger, attempted to sever the link, to lobotomize the lictor remotely to prevent the infection from spreading, but it was too late. The Mind Flayer had wedged the door open. The lictor's eyes turned from their predatory yellow to a dull, milky white. It stopped thrashing. The vines released it. The lictor stood up, its allegiance rewritten. It turned to face the oncoming Tyranid Swarm, raised its talons, and let out a screech that was not of the hive, but of the shadow. Librarian Brother Zale of the Death Watch gripped the restraint bar of the Corvus Black Star, his knuckles white against the black ceramite of his gauntlet. Even through the dampening field of his psychic hood, the scream of Vidia 4 was a physical pressure, a dull iron spike driven into his frontal lobe. He had fought the Tyranids on a dozen worlds. He knew the sensation of the shadow and the warp, that suffocating, oily silence that drowned out the light of the Emperor. But this was different. This was not silence, it was a cacophony of static, a grinding friction between two tectonic plates of psychic will. Below the gunship, the battlefield was a tapestry of madness. Through the external pict feeds, Zale watched the front lines. The standard engagement protocols of the Xenos were failing. The Tyranids were not surging forward in a mindless tide. They were probing, testing, and, most terrifying of all, hesitating. "Status?" Zale barked, his voice amplified by the Vox grill. "The Auspex is reading conflicting biological signatures, Brother Librarian," the pilot reported. "The Tyranid biomass is unstable. It is mutating in real time." On the surface, the Great Devourer demonstrated why it was the galaxy's apex survivor. The hive mind, realizing its foot soldiers were falling to the necrotic rot of the Mind Flayer, had initiated an emergency evolution cycle. The Tervagons, massive birthing beasts that acted as mobile brood nests, began to convulse. They did not spawn the standard termagants. The creatures that slithered wet and steaming from their birthing sacs were hideous variants, purpose-built for this toxic war. Their chitin was not the usual bone white. It was a dark, sealed resin, non-porous. Their respiratory vents were covered in organic filters, fleshy cowls that scrubbed the spore-choked air. These new gaunts did not bite, they vomited concentrated bioacid designed to dissolve the black vines before they could touch the flesh. Zale watched on the tactical display as a wave of these hazmat gaunts marched into the gray fog, their biocannons purging the rot with calculated efficiency. The Tyranids were adapting to the infection. But the shadow monster was not a static enemy, it was a sentient cancer, and it had found a new host. The camera drones focused on Sector 9, where a Carnifex, a living battering ram of muscle and rage, was tearing through a refinery wall. Suddenly, the beast stopped. The infected lictor, the patient zero of this new plague, had launched itself onto the Carnifex's back, driving its feeder tendrils into the larger beast's spinal column. It wasn't an attack of predation, it was an injection of will. The Carnifex roared, a sound that shifted from a guttural challenge to a high-pitched shriek of violation. Black smoke poured from its eyes and mouth. The Mind Flayer was no longer content with small, weak human vessels. It seized the massive biological potential of the Tyranid war machine. The Carnifex's purple skin rippled as if things were moving underneath it. It dropped to its knees, clutching its massive scything talons, trying to claw out the presence that was rewriting its mind. "Emperor, protect us," Zale whispered. The transformation was instant and horrifying. The Carnifex rose, but its silhouette had changed. The Mind Flayer's influence forced a rapid, brutal mutation. From the Carnifex's armored back, 6 massive spindly legs erupted through the heavy chitin plates in a spray of gore. They were the legs of the shadow spider, composed of bone and solidified shadow, lifting the massive bulk of the Carnifex into the air like a grotesque centaur. The beast's face split open, the jaw unhinging to reveal not a tongue, but a flower-like maw of petal teeth. This abomination, a Flayerfex, turned on its own brood. With a speed that belied its size, it skittered sideways across the battlefield, its shadow legs impaling Tyranid warriors. It unleashed a wave of telekinetic force that crushed a Tervagon flat, bursting its spawn sacs. The hive mind's unity was shattered. The Tyranids were fighting a mirror image of their own biological strength, twisted by a dimension of hate. The reaction from the hive mind was brutal and immediate. Zale felt the psychic backlash snap through the ether like a whip crack. The hive mind, realizing that the Flayerfex acted as a transmitter of the corruption, performed the psychic equivalent of amputation. It severed the synaptic link to every Tyranid organism within 5 miles of the abomination. Thousands of gaunts and warriors instantly went feral, their coordinated movements dissolving into animalistic confusion. They stopped fighting the Mind Flayer's forces and began to tear at each other in a blind panic. But the hive mind was not retreating, it was isolating the infection. High above, the bioships shifted alignment. The Flayerfex roared at the sky, challenging the stars, but the hive mind had marked it for deletion. "They are cutting their losses," Zale whispered, his hand hovering over the Exterminatus button on his console, though he knew it was too early. The hive mind is afraid. It is the first time in history it has encountered a hunger that rivals its own. The Neurothrope, a floating cathedral of bone and pulsating brain matter, drifted over the corpse-choked trench lines of Sector 9. It did not touch the ground. Gravity was a suggestion it chose to ignore. Around it, a coven of 6 zoanthropes bobbed in the air like macabre balloons, their oversized craniums glowing with a sickly emerald witchlight. This was the hive mind's answer to the stalemate, where claws and bioacid had failed to scrub the stain of the Mind Flayer from the planet. The Tyranids would bring the weight of their soul hunger to bear. Hive Fleet Kronos was unique among the devouring swarms. It was bred to kill gods. It did not fear the sorcery of the warp, it swallowed it. The Neurothrope sensed the presence of the Mind Flayer not as a creature, but as a frequency, a low, grinding static that tasted of old iron and cold ashes. The Great Devourer found this frequency offensive. It was an unordered noise in the perfect silence of the hive. The directive pulsed from the Norn Queen in orbit, relayed through the Neurothrope's spinal spine. Silence the noise. Burn the shadow. The gathering of power was not subtle. The air around the Neurothrope began to distort, heating up until the falling gray ash turned into drops of molten slag before hitting the ground. The creature's dorsal spine, a jagged horn, began to hum. It was drawing upon the shadow in the warp, the massive psychic null field generated by the billions of Tyranid organisms on the planet. Usually this field simply suffocated enemy psychers, cutting them off from the warp like a diver severed from their air hose. But here the Neurothrope twisted that null field into a weapon. It siphoned the psychic potential of its zoanthrope kin, draining them until their bodies withered and shriveled, acting as living batteries for the strike. The Mind Flayer, sensing the buildup, turned the attention of its flare effects avatar toward the floating brain beast. The avatar roared, raising its shadow legs to strike, but it was like a man trying to punch a thunderstorm. The Tyranid was no longer a biological organism. It was a conduit for the anger of a galaxy-spanning superorganism. The release was instantaneous. A lance of pure green biolightning erupted from the Neurothrope's cranium. This was the warp blast, a concentrated beam of psychic energy powerful enough to crack the hull of a land raider. It struck the Flayerfex square in the chest. There was no explosion, no fire. Instead, reality shrieked. The beam hit the Mind Flayer's psionic shield, a wall of red, crackling telekinetic energy. The two forces collided, the green, hungry light of the Tyranids against the red, necrotic lightning of the Upside Down. The sound was not heard with ears, it was felt in the teeth and the marrow. It was the sound of two dimensions grinding against each other. The Flayerfex began to unmake itself. The shadow matter that composed its extra limbs boiled away, hissing as it evaporated into nothingness. The flesh of the Carnifex host beneath blackened and turned to dust, stripping the avatar down to its constituent atoms. The Mind Flayer was being exorcised. But the Mind Flayer was vast, and it was spiteful. As its avatar disintegrated, it lashed out. It did not attack the Neurothrope's body, it attacked the connection. It poured its consciousness, a cold, drowning ocean of misery and isolation, straight up the beam of energy, back into the Neurothrope. The feedback loop was catastrophic. The Neurothrope spasmed, its bulbous head swelling as veins burst beneath the translucent skin. The psychic shockwave radiated outward, moving faster than sound. 5 miles away, in the Imperial rear guard, a platoon of Cadian shock troopers suddenly stopped running. Simultaneously, their helmets pressurized. Their noses began to bleed profusely, and then, in a gruesome display of synchronized death, their heads detonated. They simply ceased to be, their brains liquefied by the overflow of the psychic duel. The ground beneath the Neurothrope turned to glass. The air smelled of ozone and copper. The shadow in the warp flickered for just a moment, stunned by the sheer alien hate of the entity it was trying to eat. The stalemate broke. The Mind Flayer, realizing it could not win a direct contest of will against a hive mind that had consumed 1,000,000 worlds, chose survival over pride. It released its hold on the material plane. The red lightning faded. The suffocating pressure lifted, replaced by the vacuum of its departure. The Flayerfex collapsed, a heap of dry bone and ash. The Neurothrope lowered itself to the ground, exhausted, smoke rising from its cranial vents. It had won the battle, but the war had shifted. The Mind Flayer had not been destroyed, it had retreated. It had pulled its consciousness back through the rifts, deep into the safety of its own dimension, the Upside Down. The hive mind, sensing the prey fleeing into its burrow, felt a new sensation. It was not relief, it was the thrill of the chase. The prey had nowhere left to run. If the enemy would not come out to be eaten, the hive fleet would go in. Magos Kalin, or what remained of him, stood sentinel at the threshold of the abyss. His consciousness was no longer a neat procession of binary logic. It was a fractured mosaic, held together by the cold, sticky will of the Mind Flayer. Half of his face had been stripped away, revealing the gleaming chrome skull beneath, while the other half was a ruin of gray, necrotic flesh. He did not feel pain, he felt only the collective. He stood inside the main rift in Sector 7, his ocular sensors gazing out into the Upside Down. It was a realm of infinite melancholy, a mirror reflection of the materium stripped of all warmth. Ash drifted like memories of the dead through a sky that knew no sun. He was waiting for the Tyranids to falter, to retreat from the psychic scream that had just silenced the battlefield. But the Tyranids did not retreat. The hive mind did not understand fear, it only understood hunger, and now it knew where the meat was hiding. The ground shook with a rhythmic tectonic violence. The hive mind had deployed its siege breakers. From the smoke of the battlefield, the Trigons emerged, massive serpentine nightmares with scything talons the size of tank turrets. They did not attack the Imperial lines, they attacked the rift itself. With a sound like tearing metal, the Trigons plunged their claws into the edges of the reality tear, physically wrenching it wider. The bioelectric fields generated by their rattling spines stabilized the portal, preventing it from snapping shut. The Mind Flayer, watching through Kalin's single remaining organic eye, felt a surge of genuine alarm. The prey was breaking down the door. The Tyranids were not content to hold the ground, they were following the scent of the shadow into its own dimension. The rift groaned, stretching beyond its limits until it was a gaping maw wide enough to march a titan through. The invasion of the Upside Down began with a silence that was more terrifying than any roar. The gaunts poured through the expanded rift, a carpet of chitin and clicking claws. As they crossed the threshold, the laws of physics shifted. Gravity became lighter, less insistent. The air was toxic, filled with heavy metal particulates and spores that would liquefy a human lung in seconds. The Tyranids faltered for a microsecond as the atmosphere hit their spiracles, but the hive mind adjusted the biological parameters instantly. The swarm did not stop. They surged into the gray gloom, their purple and white carapaces standing out like fresh bruises against the monochromatic landscape of the Shadow Realm. They scuttled over the vine-choked ruins of the Mirror Refinery, their sensory tendrils tasting the rot. They were explorers in a graveyard, and they had come to eat the bones. But the Mind Flayer was a god in this place, and the environment itself obeyed its will. The floating spores in the air magnetized, coalescing into razor-sharp clouds that stripped the flesh from the leading gaunts. The black vines that covered every surface sprang to life, spearing the invaders and dragging them into the dark earth. Yet for every Tyranid that died, the hive mind learned. Kalin watched with detached horror as the second wave of Tyranids entered. These ones were different. Their carapaces were covered in a thick mucus-like secretion that neutralized the toxic air. Their eyes, useless in the perpetual gloom, had atrophied, replaced by heightened vibration sensors along their flanks to detect the movement of the vines. The Tyranids were adapting to the upside down faster than the dimension could kill them. They began to feed on the black vines, their acidic stomachs breaking down the shadow matter into usable slurry. The sky above the mirror refinery darkened further as the Mind Flayer played its hand. A screeching swarm of Demobats descended from the thunderheads, a whirlwind of leather wings and needle teeth. They dived upon the ground forces, lifting gaunts into the air and tearing them apart. The Tyranids responded in kind. From the rift a cloud of gargoyles and harpies erupted, meeting the Demobats in the air. The aerial dogfight was a blur of motion, the biological perfection of the Tyranid flyers clashing with the chaotic ragdoll flight of the shadow creatures. Bodies rained down like hail, broken wings, severed tails, and chunks of gray flesh. Kalen, his logic circuits overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the biological attrition, realized the terrifying truth. The Tyranids were winning. They were not just surviving the Upside Down, they were colonizing it. The Great Devourer had found a new ecosystem, and it intended to consume it down to the bedrock. The Mind Flayer, realizing that its shadow corruption could not infect the hive mind, enacted a desperate protocol. It pulled every shred of infected matter, metal, flesh, and bone, into a single point in reality. The sky tore open, bleeding a violent violet light, as the Shadow King manifested its full physical form, a titan-sized spider, constructed of flayed meat and solidified darkness, standing tall to crush the invasion with its own hands. The hive mind did not pause, it simply escalated. The ground quaked as the Tyranids deployed their god-killers. A massive Hierophant Biotitan shrieked, towering over the ruins, while at its feet the ultimate duelist stepped forward, the Swarmlord. Armed with 4 crackling bone sabers, the beast did not feel the psychic dread radiating from the spider. It only saw a massive meal that needed to be butchered. The duel began with a clash that shattered the city's foundation. The Swarmlord leaped, a blur of muscle and chitin, but the Mind Flayer caught it in a grip of pure telekinetic force. With a gesture of its shadow claws, the Mind Flayer ripped the Swarmlord apart in mid-air, flaying its armor layer by layer until nothing remained but a mist of purple blood. The Shadow King roared, believing it had won. But the silence was short-lived. Before the first Swarmlord's corpse even hit the ground, the spore clouds parted, and a second, identical Swarmlord stepped out, its strategy already adapted to the telekinetic attack. The Mind Flayer lashed out again, but this time the Tyranid parried the invisible blow with psychic shadow in the warp energy. The shadow monster was winning the physical fight, but it was losing the war of attrition. For the first time in eons, the Mind Flayer felt a sensation akin to panic. It realized it could not scare the Tyranids because they possessed no individual ego to break. There was no fear to feed on, only an endless, unfeeling hunger. The giant spider was no longer the predator. It was trapped in a cage with 1 billion hungry mouths. And for the first time, the Upside Down was the one being hunted. From the observation deck, librarian brother Zakiel watched the sensors with growing horror. The war had ceased to be a battle. It had become a rapid, cancer-like evolution. The Mind Flayer, desperate and cornered, began weaving Tyranid biomass into its own design, birthing Demo-Tyranids, abominations with the chitin of Genestealers and the petal faces of Demogorgons. But the hive mind's response was not to fight these new monsters, but to digest them. The stalemate broke not with a bang, but with a feast. The Tyranid swarms stopped attacking the shadows and began to physically consume them. Their digestive pools bubbled with strange enzymes, breaking down the semi-real substance of the Upside Down at a molecular level. They were finding nutrients in the rot. They were eating the nightmare. A psychic scream tore across the sector, a sound so piercing it shattered the glass of the Imperial ship's bridge. It was the Mind Flayer, realizing it was no longer the predator. It was being unmade. Zachiel's hand hovered over the Exterminatus button. He realized the terrifying truth. The Mind Flayer was merely a distinct entity, but the Tyranids were a biological sponge. By defeating the shadow monster, they were not just killing it, they were absorbing its abilities. The sensors confirmed Zachiel's worst fears. The Tyranids had begun to phase in and out of reality. They had synthesized the Shadow Walk. The Empire was no longer just fighting a swarm, they were fighting a ghost. The Imperial fleet did not wait for a winner. The order was given: Exterminatus. Cyclonic torpedoes rained down, cracking the planet's crust and burning the atmosphere, but the fire came too late. A surviving servo-skull recording from the surface revealed the final moments before the flames took over. The Tyranids had won. The gates to the Upside Down were not open, they were sealed shut, plastered over with thick alien bioresin. The hive mind had not just beaten the intruder, it had locked the door and swallowed the key. As the planet burned below, the hive fleet began to move away from orbit. But these were not the ships that had arrived. The biovessels were no longer just bone white and purple, they now pulsed with deep glowing veins of red energy. They moved without engine flares, sliding silently through the void, phasing between real space and the shadow dimension. The hive mind had consumed the essence of the Mind Flayer. It had learned to travel through the nightmare realms. The Great Devourer had evolved again. We feared the alien would eat our flesh. We should have feared what it would learn from our nightmares. The war for the galaxy has just changed, and we are already obsolete.